In the opening prayer for today's Mass, we ask God for the grace that our will might be conformed to His own. And in a sense, this is what is at the essence of Christian prayer, is to bring our will in alignment with and in conformity with the will of God. And here's in a way that St. Augustine would describe the whole dynamic of prayer. We approach God, in prayer, and our hearts are very, very small. In fact, they are so small, they're incapable of receiving the great gifts that God Himself is prepared to give to us. But we simply do not recognize or have confidence in that fact. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, nor has it dawned on anyone the great things God has prepared for those who love Him. You see, prayer is an act of faith. And in that act of faith, we approach God with love. Weak as that love may be, but nonetheless, it's not as though God is going to match the weakness of our love with more weak love. We need to come with a humility and a receptivity to be loved by the God who made us. And it's in receiving that love of God that our own heart is enlarged, little by little. And as our heart is enlarged by the love of God, our capacity to love God also increases, and with the increase of that love also comes an increase of desire. A desire that will be large enough to receive the greatness of the gifts that God has prepared to bestow upon us. He's simply waiting until we have the capacity to receive them. But how often in our prayers do we approach the Lord the way James and John did in today's gospel? Do you recognize yourself in their prayer? Have you ever caught yourself praying in the way in which they prayed? Jesus, I want you to do whatever I tell you to do. I know all these people involved. I understand the situation. To save you the trouble, I have it all figured out. Just do this, and everything will be fine. What's almost more amusing than the way James and John, approached Jesus Christ, with the petition to do whatever they say, is that the Lord actually entertained their request. He already knew what they were going to ask. He wasn't put off or offended. He knew exactly where this conversation was going to go. And so he says, okay, what do you want me to do for you? They wanted honor and glory. Does that seem unreasonable to you? Does it seem unseemly that a Christian would approach Jesus Christ and ask for honor and glory? Or is this an entirely reasonable request? Legitimate? Well, to answer that question, we begin by looking at the desires of our heart. Some desires we can discern as clearly originating from the flesh. But there are others, not so much. And we perceive that they have a different origin. And so where would the desire for honor and glory originate within us if it was not placed in there by God Himself? Because honor and glory is what we were created for. It has everything to do with our supernatural destiny. We were created for glory. And to recognize that desire and to hunger and thirst for it is to hunger and to thirst for participation in the very divine life of God and the unending and unmitigated joy of the happiness of heaven. But see, just because we have these good desires that are placed within us by God does not mean that we can misinterpret those desires and think of them in terms less than what God intended. You see, James and John, we're thinking more in temporal terms. And Jesus Christ redirected their attention to things that are heavenly and eternal, so that they might properly understand their desire. Can you be baptized with the baptism with which I must be baptized? Can you drink the cup which I myself must drink? These are two very evocative images that are being presented to us by Jesus Christ. Because, in the Jewish imagination, water and being overwhelmed by water as one is immersed in baptism, calls to mind these images, say like of the great flood, chaos, calamity, destruction, death. And in the Jewish mind, there's only two cups that God offers. One is a cup of blessing, and the other is the cup of His divine wrath. And so when Jesus Christ, is presenting these two very powerful images, He is using, that image of water as a sign of His own baptism, which is referring to His passion and death. You see the tumultuous crowd. You see the scene, in the courts of the high priests, of Pontius Pilate, of Herod. You see chaos. You see in His physical sufferings, the destruction of His flesh. You see His death. Being overwhelmed by these things. But the irony, of course, we know, is that He rose from the dead, and so it was not Jesus Christ who was, as it were, strictly speaking, the victim of these things, though he made himself victim. It is rather sin and death and their power over us that he destroyed. And certainly, in his passion, he drank very deeply from the cup of God's judgment of sin in the world. But in his drinking it, he converted it into a cup of blessing. Is not, St. Paul says, the cup of blessing which we bless a participation in the very blood of Jesus Christ? The blood that cleanses, heals, and sanctifies. And so because you don't have a Jewish imagination, but rather a Catholic one, you immediately see beyond and behind the veil of these images and understand the significance of how these two elements of blood and water reappear at his crucifixion when Jesus Christ slept the sleep of death on the cross. His side was opened by a soldier's lance, and what? Immediately there came forth blood and water, which the church has always understood to be the sacraments that give us new life in Jesus Christ. The sacrament of baptism, the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. But we still do not escape the central question. Because at the end of the day, to be a Christian, to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, is to do exactly as he said, to deny ourselves each day, take up our cross, and follow in his footsteps. You see, the battle has already been fought and won by Jesus Christ himself. By rising from the dead, he firmly planted in this world the standard of his kingship, his victory over sin, over death, and its power over us. And that victory he has given to us. However, there's always a caveat. On the day of our baptism, in the waters that Jesus Christ charged with the power of his cross and resurrection, yes, we were cleansed. We were completely regenerated and became an utterly new creation. And for us, that's when the battle began. But not as though it is a battle that needs to be won, but it is rather a battle that needs to be fought with confidence in the victory that has already been given to us. To move forward in our Christian lives with confidence, in great trust in the mercy and the love of God. Because one thing is perfectly obvious, is that being a Christian does not exempt us from our share of suffering in this world and in our life. And just like Jesus Christ, the camel that had to pass through the eye of the needle of his own suffering, so we too must pass through the eye as well. So that in bearing our suffering with confidence in the mercy of God, that needle may sew together and repair the torn fabric of our humanity wounded by sin and make us whole. But we may say, well, that all sounds good and fine, but where is that victory? Where do I access it? How do I appropriate it and take it for myself? And it's precisely in the cup of blessing which we bless, which is that very participation in the blood of Jesus Christ. You see, it is in the Holy Eucharist that Jesus Christ, it's not as though he has just simply given us what is sufficient. He has given us in excess, because he has given us his entire self in the sacrament of his body and blood, which we identify as Catholics as being a foretaste and a pledge of our future glory in heaven. And in receiving the whole Christ in the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist, we receive his strength to bear our hardships, to endure our sufferings with patience, for love of him. We have to lean, and lean very hard and very heavily upon Jesus Christ, present in the Holy Eucharist. And so we conclude by taking a glance at today's second reading from the letter to the Hebrews, because who is this Jesus Christ? The letter to the Hebrews told us this morning that he is our faithful high priest. And what is a priest? A priest is someone who offers sacrifice. A priest is someone who intercedes and advocates for the one for whom he makes sacrifice. What has Jesus Christ offered as our high priest? His own flesh. And how does he intercede and advocate for us? By the shedding of his own blood, that we're told speaks more eloquently to God than that of the blood of Abel that was spilled by his brother Cain. And we are told that this high priest is not unable to sympathize with us in our weakness. You see, the letter to the Hebrew doesn't say that Jesus Christ, our high priest, can sympathize with most of our weaknesses, or some of our weaknesses, or this or that weakness, or even 99.99% of our weaknesses, but all our weaknesses. Each and every one of them without exception. And he was tested in every possible way, except without sinning. And so we have confidence in this priest, this advocate, who never ceases to plead on our behalf, because he knows. And the letter to the Hebrews tells us this because what it says next is key. It's what's important. It says, "Therefore, let us approach confidently the throne of grace." Let us approach confidently the throne of grace to receive mercy. There is no mercy without understanding. The letter to the Hebrews just made it clear Christ perfectly understands. And so his mercy is given to us with understanding our weaknesses and the tests we must endure each day. And it's for that reason then the letter to the Hebrews says, "And receive from him the grace we need in all of our difficulties, right? To receive the grace we need. The problem is, we lack confidence, and without confidence, we simply choose not to ask.